We have one last topic we need to cover before we close this module, and it is about how psychological phenomena, such as intelligence or aggression, might be influenced by our genetic makeup. Do genes matter, and if so, how much? These are the kinds of questions that the science of behavioral genetics attempts to answer, and as it turns out, the answers are extremely complicated. Let's explore together why. First, let's talk about the different kinds of study designs that researchers in the field of behavioral genetics might use. This is much more difficult than setting up a regular lab experiment because you can't ethically manipulate the genetics of a human person. Instead, researchers have had to take advantage of naturally occurring phenomena to understand whether and how genes might be involved in influencing an outcome of interest. And there are two naturally occurring phenomena in particular that researchers can use to study this question: child adoption and sets of twins. In an adoption study, researchers compare children who have been adopted with both their adopted and biological parents on a particular trait, such as intelligence, aggression, or levels of extroversion. Of course, researchers would never force a child to be adopted. That would be highly unethical. But when adoption already naturally occurs, researchers can recruit participants from adoptive families to participate and measure the traits that they are interested in. You might be wondering why researchers need to study adoptive children. Why not simply compare children to their own biological parents? Well, children who were raised by their biological parents share two things. They share, on average, roughly 50% of their genes, but they also share a lot of their environment, too. So, for children who were raised by their biological parents, similarity on any behavioral trait could be due to shared genetic factors, but it could also be due to the many experiences that the child has had growing up in the family. For example, I am very similar to my biological mom in a lot of ways. Our voices sound very similar when we answer the phone, and we often catch ourselves about ready to say the same thing at the same time. Why are my mom and I so similar? Well, it could be because we share roughly 50% of our genes, but it could also be because of all the shared experiences I have with my mom and the way that she raised me. So when we look at biological children raised by their biological parents, we just don't know what is responsible for the similarity: genes or environment. When children are adopted, however, this lets researchers try to isolate the cause a bit more. This is because while adopted children will of course share more genetic material with their biological parents, they will share more of their environment with their adoptive parents. So we can look to see who adoptive children more closely resemble on average. If a sample of adopted children tends to more closely resemble their adoptive parents on some trait, then we would conclude that perhaps one's environment has a stronger influence on that particular outcome. If, however, on average adopted children still more closely resemble their biological parents, this would indicate that perhaps genetics might be playing a stronger role. For example, one surprising study found that the body weight of adopted children more closely resembled their biological versus adoptive parents, even though the adoptive parents are presumably the ones who have more control over what the child actually eats. Of course, this isn't to say that our weight is simply predetermined or that diet and exercise have no impact on our health outcomes. They certainly do. However, it does indicate that genetics might be playing an important role here too. The second type of study design that researchers might use is called a twin study. To understand how this works, we first need to understand that there are two kinds of twins: identical and fraternal. In identical twins, there is only one fertilized egg, called a zygote, that splits into two during the normal cell division and multiplication process, which we'll talk more about in Module 7. For this reason, identical twins are sometimes called monozygotic twins, where mono is a root meaning one, so monozygotic simply means that they both came from the same single zygote. Because of this, identical or monozygotic twins are genetically exactly the same. They share 100% of their DNA, and thus will look exactly alike. In fraternal twins, two eggs are released and fertilized at the same time. So fraternal twins are sometimes called dizygotic twins because they come from two separate zygotes. Fraternal twins share on average about 50% of their DNA and are no more genetically similar or different than ordinary siblings. However, because fraternal twins were born at the same time and thus presumably share more of their environment, including their prenatal environment, they are a better comparison for identical twin pairs than other pairs of siblings. In twin studies, the researchers can compare the similarity of identical twin pairs who share 100% of their DNA versus the similarity of fraternal twin pairs who only share roughly 50% of their DNA. If a trait has a genetic component, who do you expect would be more similar? Remember that identical twins share more of their DNA than fraternal twins, so if identical twins are more similar, the logical assumption is that they are more similar because of the greater similarity in their genetic makeup. Let's look at a real example. Here's a graph of the concordance rates for monozygotic twins, shown in the black bars, and dizygotic twins, shown in the gray bars, across several different disorders. Looking at this graph, what do you notice? First, let's look at the top set of bars comparing the concordance rate for monozygotic and dizygotic twins on autism. It looks like monozygotic sets of twins have a much higher concordance rate compared to dizygotic sets of twins, so genes appear to play a very strong role in the development of this disorder. In contrast, both monozygotic and dizygotic twins appear to have very similar concordance rates for major depressive disorder, which is abbreviated in the graph as MDD. So, although genes might still play a role, it looks like environment also probably matters a lot too. Let's pause for a quick application practice question. Which of the following results would suggest to you that a particular outcome is likely more strongly influenced by genes versus the environment? The answer is C, if adoptive children more closely resemble their biological versus adoptive parents. So what have twin and adoption studies found? Are genes relevant not just for physical traits, but for psychological ones too? First, you might be wondering how on earth genes could be related to complex psychological phenomena. To answer this question, we need to look more at what a gene actually is. A gene is a segment of DNA that codes for something, usually a protein, and proteins together help make up your tissues and organ systems. You may have thought of proteins before as being important for building muscle, but that's just one of their many jobs. In fact, proteins are incredibly important for virtually everything your body does. They provide structure to the various cells in your body, such as your skin cells and hair cells, and they also help to break down nutrients in the foods you eat, clear viruses and bacteria from your body, and transport small molecules, such as transporting oxygen through your bloodstream. Since genes tell your body which proteins to make and in what quantity, this is why genes are often thought of as being the blueprint for life. Proteins also play a role in the functioning of your nervous system and neurotransmitters. So to the extent that these physical processes are related to our psychological outcomes, this provides a mechanism by which genes might influence psychological responses. And this could potentially be relevant not just for mental illness, like autism or major depressive disorder, but for other kinds of psychological phenomena too, such as personality development. However, there are some big caveats here that we need to mention. First, there is almost no outcome that is determined by just a single gene. Even relatively straightforward physical traits, such as eye color and physical height, are coded for by the interaction of many different genes. In fact, some estimates suggest that there are over 12,000 genetic variants involved in helping to determine your height. Complex psychological phenomena likely depend on many more. Second, genes and environment are always working together. For example, physical height appears to be highly genetic, with a heritability estimate of around 80%. But even physical height can still be strongly influenced by environmental factors, such as access to adequate nutrition. Similarly, just as genes can potentially influence neurotransmitter functioning, so too can your environment. In fact, studies have found that individuals undergoing cognitive therapy for obsessive-compulsive disorder saw changes in their brain functioning in just a few weeks, even without taking any medication. So it's often too simplistic to say that genes contribute a certain percentage or amount toward a given outcome. For example, I have a friend who likes to say, marriage isn't 50-50, it's 100-100. I think that saying applies nicely here too. It's not that genes contribute so much and environment contributes the rest. Rather, you always need both. This is because genes and environment often combine or interact in interesting ways. For example, one famous study by Avshalom Caspi and colleagues looked at how both genes and environment can contribute to the likelihood of developing depression. They found that certain individuals, represented in this graph by the top blue line, had a genetic risk factor that increased their likelihood of developing depression. Specifically, they had a variant of a specific gene that affects serotonin production. And remember from our previous video that serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is believed to be involved in helping regulate our mood. However, in the absence of any negative life experience, notice that these individuals were no more likely to develop depression than those without this genetic risk factor. It was only when people had accumulated several negative life experiences that those with the genetic risk factor appeared to actually be at a greater risk of going on to develop depression. In other words, it wasn't just genes or just environment. Rather, both mattered together. There's even some evidence that environmental input can change how our genes are expressed, effectively turning some genes on and other genes off. This is a phenomenon called epigenetics. And I think this is all really encouraging news because it means that there are things that you can do today to affect your environment that can influence your outcomes. For a great video that nicely explains how epigenetics works, as well as some recent research and findings in that area, you can check out the supplemental TED Talk video on Canvas. In this video, we discuss the field of behavioral genetics. For the exam, you should be able to define gene and explain what genes do, define and distinguish between twin and adoption studies, given an example, interpret the results from twin and adoption studies, explain why twin and adoption studies are necessary to study the relative impact of genes versus environment on a particular outcome, and discuss how both genes and environment work together to influence various outcomes.